Ich begrüße Sie herzlich zu dieser ökumenischen Gastvorlesung im Jahre 2023. Ich werde nun gleich ins Englische wechseln, damit unser Gastreferent auch versteht, was ich über ihn Rühmenswertes oder weniger Rühmenswertes alles sagen werde. I just said that I'm now switching to English, and I welcome you very much here in this ecumenical guest lecture at the end of the week for praying for the unity of Christians. We always have this guest lecture in the context of this week of praying for the unity of Christians. I want to reflect here together Catholic theology and Protestant theology on the possibilities of strengthening the unity, but also mentioning the problematic sides or the difficulties. And today I'm very happy to have in this series of lectures we had, which mainly were done by Protestant or Catholic theologians, that we have today an Orthodox theologian. So in this praying for the unity of Christians, there are so many denominations we should not forget, because we here in Münster have two faculties, one Protestant and Catholic theology. And I especially welcome here now Professor Dr. Cyril Hoveroon, who will be introduced by me immediately. He will address a topic which is connected to what we read every day in newspapers, connected to the war situation in Ukraine, the war of Russia against Ukraine. And this has also a Christian or religious side. Last year we had many debates on, say, the involvement of the churches into this conflict, especially the role of the Patriarchate in Moscow. And there have been some analysis and also some statements being very critical to his very nationalistic theology, which, especially from a Protestant point of view, there is a sensitivity for this because we have failed. We have done the same failure. And therefore, we are looking on this critically. Now, in the context of the assembly of the World Council of Churches in September in Karlsruhe, this was also debated. What are the consequences of this nationalistic theology of the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church? And what does this mean for the unity, for the ecumenical question? And some people were asking for a suspension of membership of the Russian Orthodox Church in the World Council of Churches, among them people like me, and which was not respected or not realized, not heard, more or less. But that's another problem. Today we have with Cyril Hoveroon, an Orthodox theologian who is very familiar, I would say, with Moscow and Kiev, which will become clear when I inform you about very shortly about his biography. So he is also Archimandrit, the religious title, which you can look in Google what this means. And Professor Dr. Cyril Hoveroon is professor for ecclesiology, international relations and ecumenical theology at the St. Ignatius College of the University College in Stockholm. He has studied at the theology at the Theological Academy in Kiev and also at the National University in Athens. And after that, did his PhD at the University of Durham under the supervision of Professor Andrew Louth. He was then presiding the Department for External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and also first deputy presiding person of the educational board of the Russian Orthodox Church, in a role in which he worked with the present Patriarch Kirill in Moscow. Later, he was doing research in Yale and Columbia University. He was very important, also guest professor here in Münster and within the Cluster of Excellency as a special guest. Then he was also director, and still is involved in that, in the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at the Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and their assistant professor. He is international fellow at the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta in Canada, and guest professor present at the Gregoriana in Rome. He has a really productive big list of publications which show his productivity. Books like 2022 published Eastern Christianity in its Texts. Then he has Italian publication with Waldensian people, La Riconciliazione della Memorie. I ignore the subtitle. Then 2019, a book on sacred architecture in East and West, edited book, written book, Political Orthodoxies, the Unorthodoxies of the Church Coerced, 2018. Then 2017 published Ukrainian Public Theology in Ukrainian language. Then a book which addresses ecclesiology, 2017, Scaffolds of the Church towards post-structural ecclesiology. And I think now that's enough. Only to give impression on titles. He is very much related at present with this issue about the churches in the Ukraine. And I think that you may address this. And so I give you now the microphone. And we are looking forward to your paper.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for coming to this meeting, despite the fact that the weather is not exactly Roman here, and you made it. Thank you for that. Also, thank you for inviting me here to this meeting. Thank you for inviting me to Münster. I recollect with fondness several months that I spent here in 2018 as a part of this excellence cluster. And actually, my book, which is most relevant to our subject here, the political orthodoxies, about the situation with how the churches have become ideologized in Russia and in Ukraine. This book was accomplished while I was a part of this excellence cluster. So it's in a sense, it's a fruit, it's a product of my fellowship here at Münster, which I really appreciate. Today, well, I should say that that's true. During the last year, since the war escalated in February 2022, I've been writing a lot on the war, on the situation, and so forth. But there is a topic which is relatively new to me, and which I would like to address tonight. It's a topic of the involvement of the global ecumenical networks, particularly the World Council of Churches, in the war in Ukraine. How do they react, or do not react, and how they can react eventually to this war? I think it is important because, well, this war is not anymore a local thing. It's not just a local conflict. This is a thing that affects the entire Europe and beyond, and it certainly affects global churches and global ecumenical networks. I believe that whatever we want, however we see ecumenism in the years that come, it will be a different sort of ecumenism, whether we want it or don't want it. I think we need to face a new reality. We need somehow to reflect and to acknowledge a new reality which is emerging. And in my presentation, I'm going to address this new emerging reality of new ecumenism. So I believe. That hence is my title, Can Ecumenism as Usual Be Possible in the Wake of the Ukrainian War? So essentially, I'm going to explore this ecumenism as usual, as a usual business, and alternatives to this ecumenism as usual. If we look at the global ecumenical movement during the 20th century, we can observe that it was to a great extent shaped by European wars. Both world wars became its milestones. Yes, the Edinburgh Conference, which springboarded modern ecumenism, was convened before the World War I in 1910, as we all know. However, the Orthodox churches joined the ecumenical movement after this war. The Ecumenical Patriarchate, in the famous encyclical letter published in 1920, suggested establishing a League of Churches, a prototype of the modern WCC, following the model of the post-World War I League of Nations. Ecumenism was boosted again after the World War II. One of its rationales became rebuilding Europe and advocating for peace around the globe. The WCC embedded this rationale par excellence. Unfortunately, this organization failed to fulfill its mission when the war in Ukraine was waged in February 2014. Not 22, the war began in 2014. Following the Revolution of Dignity, which ousted President Yanukovych and his autocratic regime, Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea and started a proxy war in Donbass. The WCC reacted to these events belatedly by sending its delegation to Ukraine only in March 2015, 13 months after the war started. The delegation published a communique with some, in my judgment, ambivalent assessments, such as the following one, I'm quoting. During this visit, the delegation has heard different perspectives on the origins of the conflict. In any event, the delegation is convinced of the potential of the churches and faith communities of Ukraine to play a lead role in transcending the competing nationalisms, I'd like to stress this phrase, that predispose groups towards conflict. In the WCC's interpretation, the war, thus, was a competition of nationalisms. The statement, in this way, unequivocally implied a Ukrainian nationalism, so to say, as the main reason that had provoked the Russian aggression. I think this was a grave misreading of the events. As I mentioned, the aggression became a reaction to the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, which had been driven not by nationalism, but by the longing of the Ukrainian civil society for justice, transparency, and solidarity, the supposedly core values of the WCC's own ethics. The members of the WCC's delegation failed, I believe, to see that Ukraine was effectively fighting for their own values. 7 years later, the Russian propaganda inflated the Ukrainian nationalism from the statement of the WCC to Ukrainian neo-Nazism, which was presented as the main pretext to start a full-scale war. You probably remember all those speeches, sermons by Vladimir Putin, who spoke, and his cronies who spoke about Ukrainian neo-Nazism. The WCC statement facilitated this inflation. Of course, this was not the delegation's intention, but its visit to Ukraine was used by the Russian Orthodox Church to promote messages it wanted to broadcast globally through the platform of the WCC. It is also worthy to note that the March 2015 statement put the two sides of the conflict, so that is the word they use in the statement, on an equal footing. I think it became a malicious tradition that continues to our days. In other words, to put on the same scale, the Russian and the Ukrainian involvement in the war. After the statement was published in the early 2015, for about 7 years, the WCC did not emit clear signals about the war that went on the European continent, even though it had promised to, and I quote again the statement, to find the means and the methods by which it can accompany the churches and people of Ukraine in a pilgrimage of justice and peace. After that, no pilgrimage of justice and peace, no facilitation from the WCC in this pilgrimage. I specifically Googled every single reference on the website of the WCC to Ukraine. I just searched through the word Ukraine in this period of time, and the only statement which was published with the reference of Ukraine at the time was the downing of MH17, the Malaysian flight, for which the WCC expressed condolences to the churches of the Netherlands. First signals came soon after the war escalated in February 2022, and some of them were even poorer than the one in 2015. Thus, in response to the Ukrainian First Lady's plea to the WCC to become Ukraine's moral and active ally, the acting General Secretary at the time, Father Ion Sauka, to whom the letter was addressed personally, published his own letter addressing both President Zelensky and President Putin. I know a bit about this exchange because I was a kind of middleman in delivering the letter from the First Lady to the WCC. In this letter, which was published by Father Ion Sauka, he continued the tradition of putting Russia and Ukraine on equal footing, as, for example, in the following passage, I quote, "On both sides, there is suffering and despair, and all are waiting for an end of the conflict. Excellencies," meaning Zelensky and Putin, "the end of conflict and the agreement on a peaceful solution is in your hands alone." I wish it was like that. "Before your people and history, you will be the only ones responsible for it." Well, probably to the same extent. "No one from outside can solve or seek to impose any solution to this fraternal conflict," which exactly resembles the rhetoric, the Russian rhetoric about fratricide, that it is essentially a civil war in Ukraine. And unfortunately, this language from the letter corroborates this judgment that this was like a civil conflict. This letter caused outrage not only in Ukraine, but also in some ecumenical circles, including in Germany, and these circles exercised pressure. As a result, Father Ioan published a new letter, now addressing the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill. This time, the letter was closer to the reality of the war. It should be acknowledged. Notwithstanding this letter to Patriarch Kirill, the signals emitted by the WCC were not helpful for the Ukrainians and those in the world who solidarized with them. We in Ukraine, we looked forward to the upcoming 11th General Assembly of the WCC in Karlsruhe with the hope that it would send a clearer message regarding the war. Such hopes were based on the fact that many reputable international organizations had already clearly condemned the aggressor, Russia, and when they could, they suspended cooperation with it. On various occasions, the WCC demonstrated a wide variety of instruments to deal with wars and military conflicts. One can see this variety by looking, for example, at the case of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, in the wake of the upcoming General Assembly, the arsenal of anti-military measures, so to say, was reduced to the discussions about whether to exclude or keep the Russian Orthodox Church among the WCC's members. I believe it was a bit of a false dilemma to keep or not to keep, because I think the arsenal, the instrumentarium of measures could be much wider than just to discuss whether to keep or not to keep them. Well, I personally was to reject them, but I believe that there were so many other things to be applied, to the Russian Church in order to send a signal to it. The leadership of the Moscow Patriarchate demonstratively, as we know, and as was mentioned by Hans-Peter endorses the Kremlin in its war against Ukraine, which urged many prominent figures in the ecumenical movement to call for excluding the Moscow Patriarchate from the WCC. Such calls came, as it was mentioned, by a variety of personalities and theologians, including Ron Williams, for example. There were also a similar public call to the leaders of the EKD and WCC signed by prominent public intellectuals, many of them from Germany. I assume that some of you here have read this letter, and some even signed it, and I'm grateful to you for that. These voices were mentioned, but not taken into consideration by either the Central Committee that met before the General Assembly in June, or the General Assembly itself. Father Ioan Savka explained in his opening speech at the assembly in Karlsruhe, and I quote him, "During this time, we received letters and messages from individuals and 3 churches asking us to expel," he put it in the quote marks, "the Russian Orthodox Church from the fellowship of the WCC. In consultation with the leadership of the Central Committee, I responded to such requests based on the history of the Council when our fellowship was confronted with similar situation," end of quote. However, there were no similar situations in the history of the WCC. Such a brutal war has not happened in Europe, or I would believe indeed in the world, since the World War II. Even apartheid in South Africa, which Father Ioan Savka mentioned in his address, however brutal and unjust it was, could not match the Russian brutality demonstrated in the places like Bucha or Mariupol. The churches that had supported the regime of Botha in South Africa and were not expelled from the WCC for that, still were not as directly involved as the Russian Orthodox Church has become involved in supporting Putin's regime. There was a similar situation, so to say, in Europe, but it happened before the World Council of Churches was established. Then the Deutsche Christen openly endorsed the Nazi regime. I know that comparing modern developments with the situations in Nazi Germany is often an overstretch and a manipulation, quite a temptation to make such comparisons. Nevertheless, I wonder if the WCC would have expelled the Deutsche Christen if the WCC were established before the World War II, whether this group would have been still the member of the WCC. Now, I'm not sure about how to answer this question. Notwithstanding such an impasse from the WCC's leadership, the war in Ukraine was widely discussed, both in the official meetings of the General Assembly and in its corridors. The Ukrainians were given floor to bring up their concerns. Historically, the Ukrainians participated in the World Council of Churches as members of the Russian delegations. Only a part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, those who belonged to the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, had such a privilege. After 2014, when Metropolitan Onufry, known for his anti-ecumenism, became the primate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate, this church dramatically reduced its participation in any ecumenical activities. Just an example, recently, the All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, their representatives came to Rome to meet the Pope. So there were 2 primates of the Ukrainian churches, the Greek Catholic, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, and the primate of the Autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Epiphany. They came in person, but the largest Ukrainian community, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, sent just a priest, not even a bishop, to see the Pope. So it demonstrates their attitude. And this group came for the week of Christian unity. They prayed together with the Pope in San Paulo Cathedral, and that exactly the level of representation of the church demonstrated the attitude of the church to ecumenism, and apparently the attitude is quite negative. So when it came to Karlsruhe, to send a delegation to Karlsruhe, Onufry authorized only lay people to participate in Karlsruhe. Not even a priest would go there. In the meantime, other Ukrainian Orthodox churches were persistently knocking at the doors of the WCC. They increased their efforts after they united in 2018 into one independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which was recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate and some other Orthodox churches, who, by the way, are the members of the WCC. So the recognition came from the members of the WCC. Therefore, I believe the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was eligible to be admitted to the membership. And despite this recognition, despite the persistence of this church to join the WCC, the council's doors remained locked for it. Only after the war escalated in February 2022, the WCC eventually accepted the application from the Orthodox Church of Ukraine for membership. Still, because of the WCC's bylaws, the OCU, this autocephalous church, could not yet send a delegation with the right to vote, but only observers. At the same time, the leadership of the WCC wanted to rescue the Russian membership. I believe so. It seems that the council's leaders counted on admitting the Ukrainians as observers. This looked like a classical formula quid pro quo. The Russians would stay in the WCC because the Ukrainians would participate in its General Assembly, even if as observers. However, does this formula apply to this situation? The Ukrainian participation in the WCC is long overdue. So Father Ioan Savka, to his credit, explained to me in our private exchanges. To be deprived of such a right, as it had been the case, the Ukrainians did not do anything wrong. Their only fault was that the Russians did not want them to be a member of the WCC. And the WCC cooperated with the Russians in blockading the Ukrainians. The representative of the Moscow Patriarchate in the World Council of Churches, Father Mikhail Bunyaev, was highly efficient in forging such a cooperation. Reportedly, he played a key role in composing the early ambivalent statements coming from the WCC regarding the war in Ukraine, including the one from March 2015. Well, recently, the Ukrainian government introduced sanctions against him, together with some other leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I wonder, what would be the WCC's reaction to these sanctions? It's a very open question now. The WCC explained its desire to keep the Russian Orthodox Church in this organization and welcomed it at the General Assembly by the need for dialogue. Dialogue, indeed, is one of the WCC's core values. Father Ioan Savka stated in the mentioned introductory speech at the General Assembly in Karlsruhe, and I quote him, "The WCC was created as an open platform for dialogue and encounter, for discussion and challenging one another on the path to unity," end of quote. However, was there a real and meaningful dialogue that the Russian delegation became engaged in during the General Assembly? Indeed, the Moscow Patriarchate's delegates met several religious leaders, including the representatives of the World Council of Churches leadership. However, according to the relevant information published on the official website of the Department for External Church Relations of the Moscow Patriarchate, which was responsible for this participation of the Russians in Karlsruhe, the Russians used these meetings to promote narratives and interpretations of the war in tune with the Kremlin's propaganda. This has been also confirmed by a senior member of the Russian delegation, Leonid, the former Metropolitan of Klin, who has been defrocked now by the Patriarchate of Alexandria for his uncanonical activities in Africa. He posted on his social media on the last day of the assembly, I quote, "Thanks God, we accomplished our mission and did what we could." Moreover, some Russian delegates used their presence in Karlsruhe to insult the Ukrainian delegation. The mentioned Russian Metropolitan Leonid described, as he called, the Ukrainian performance at the WCC as boring, because in his words, there was no feminine group. You probably know this is a group of female activists that usually protest bare-breasted. And I quote again, Leonid, "At the end, the violinist played something sad. He played out of tune, putting a bullet in the general line of the falseness of the Ukrainian speakers." The Russian delegation thus used this platform of dialogue, what the WCC presented as the platform of dialogue, as mostly to propagate the Kremlin's narratives and to insult the Ukrainians. The federal president of Germany, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, therefore, was right when he warned the WCC in his address on the first day of the assembly, and I quote him, "Dialogue must bring to light what is happening. Dialogue must draw attention to injustice, must identify both victims and perpetrators and their henchmen. Yet dialogue that does not move beyond pious wishes and vague generalizations can, in the worst case, become a platform for vindication and propaganda." The Russians were very upset by this speech and expressed their dismay both officially and unofficially. This is probably because the federal president nailed down their real intentions. Even the most naive Western politicians, such as Steinmeier himself, who before February 2022 was notoriously short-sighted about the Russian intentions and advocated for dialogue at any price, finally learned their lesson that the Russians usually hijack dialogues to promote their own agendas. The Russians interpreted Steinmeier's speech as an illustration of how politicians in the West interfere in the matters of the church. This was a clear manipulation, and the Russians effectively extrapolated upon Germany the Moscow Patriarchate's own experience in Russia. That's what they usually do. If you want to understand what Russia does, they usually, accuse others of what they are doing themselves. So it's the very easy way to, to understand what they do. You just listen to their propaganda, what they say about the West. That's exactly what they do themselves. This exactly applied to what they said about Steinmeier. Well, I want to mention, to quote again, Metropolitan Leonid, who posted on his social media. Steinmeier, I quote him, "Steinmeier directly demanded from the delegation of the ROK, meaning Russian Orthodox Church, to express a clear position. It was a public pressure, which mounted almost to threats. Well, our church is accustomed to pressure. Peoples in many other regions of the world also know well what the Western pressure and persecutions are." End of quote. Leonid concluded his deliberations on Steinmeier's speech with the following phrase: "He finished to prolonged applauses." Well, his language, he's quite brutal. His language in Russian really means he finished with orgasm. That is his way to interpret things, Debates in the sessions and corridors of the General Assembly were important, but everyone's attention was at the official statement on Ukraine. This statement, titled "War in Ukraine, Peace and Justice in the European Region," came out to be better than many, including myself, expected. I really liked it. In general, it was not much different from the statements by other international organizations that have condemned the Russian aggression. The General Assembly's statement clearly condemned the war as illegal and unjustifiable and named the aggressor, Russia. At the same time, the statement continued treating Ukraine and Russia in some points on the equal footing. In the line with the ill tradition of the earlier WCC's statements on Ukraine, it appealed, for example, I quote, "to all sides in the conflict to respect the principles of international humanitarian law, including especially with regard to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and for the humane treatment of prisoners of war," as if Ukraine was waging this war on the Russian territory. The WCC also renewed its call for an immediate ceasefire to halt the death and destruction, and for dialogue and negotiations to secure a sustainable peace, which demonstrated for me a complete ignorance about the nature of this particular war. However, it did not specify to whom this call was addressed. This is in contrast, for example, with another statement adopted at the same session of the General Assembly called "Seeking Justice and Peace for All in the Middle East," which used a much clearer language explicitly against the state of Israel. This statement speaks about, I quote, "Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories as illegal under international law," End of quote. I wish the WCC used the same language regarding the Russian occupation of the Ukrainian territories or its violation of the international law. Otherwise, one may have an impression that the policies of Israel concern the WCC more than the Russian genocidal war in Ukraine. In the process of drafting the declaration on the war in Ukraine, peace and justice in the European region, the WCC violated the basic principle of international diplomacy regarding Ukraine, nothing about Ukraine without the Ukrainians. The drafting group included a Russian representative, but not a Ukrainian one. In discussing the statement, the Ukrainians were again put to a disadvantaged position in comparison with the Russians. The two Ukrainian delegates were given only 1 minute each to express themselves about the draft, while the Russian delegate, Father Filaret Bulekov, now also under the Ukrainian sanctions, was given 6 minutes, which is far beyond the reglement. No doubt, he used his time generously granted by the moderator to promote the Russian narratives about the war. In particular, he likened the mentioned document to the statements coming from McDonald's or Starbucks. A Ukrainian delegate, Alexandra Kovalenko, during her 1 minute intervention reacted and said it all. I quote her, "Dear brothers and sisters, I'm asking you to hear me and to not compromise the obvious truth for the sake of diplomacy. Just name it as it is, Russian aggression against Ukraine. If the churches aren't the ones raising their voices where there is violence and injustice happening, will we still be the salt of the earth? I also appeal to the delegation of the Russian Orthodox Church and ask them, if you are against the war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, please raise your blue cards. It is very sad that you compare the blood of the Ukrainian people with Starbucks and McDonald's. Not a single Russian delegate, including those who I know that privately they are against this war, raised his or her card against the war. The Ukrainian delegates could not raise their cards because, unlike the Russians, they were not given the right to vote. Although the war as such was widely discussed in Karlsruhe, what was not properly discussed is the future of the ecumenical movement after the war. The General Assembly assessed the current situation, but chose not to chart for the WCC for the next 8 or 9 years a path to deal with the war's aftermath. Apparently, this war will end, and probably it will end before the next, hopefully, before the next General Assembly. And the WCC needed a clear vision, a chart for the future, how to deal with this aftermath, and was not provided by the General Assembly with such guidelines. Perhaps this is because the WCC does not have a synoptic vision for such a future. There is no doubt that many would want to keep the ecumenical business as usual and to preserve the ecumenical status quo. Some, however, do not believe that such a business and the status quo are possible anymore. As we all know, ecumenism did exist before the World War II, but only after the war it received a radically new momentum, which, among other things, led to establishing the WCC. Now we are facing a similar momentum. I believe that business as usual will discredit the established ecumenical movement. To reconsider its policies and partnerships in the wake of the ongoing war does not mean to punish the Russian Church. I believe it's a wrong attitude, even though many have perceived and presented the campaign about its exclusion from the WCC as a sort of punishment for the Russian Orthodox Church. I think such a campaign should aim more at facilitating the Moscow Patriarchate's metanoia and catharsis. I know it's quite easy to speak to the Protestants about the metanoia of the Church, and I believe that is what we need in Orthodoxy. Both metanoia and catharsis could be achieved through the pressure from the global ecumenical community. It seems that the Russian Church itself doesn't have resources inside, even to understand its mistakes. An external intervention, pressure is needed for that. The WCC's General Assembly unfortunately missed the kairos to positively influence the Russian Orthodox Church for the sake of the Russian Orthodox Church, not for the sake of other churches, for the sake of this very church. Moreover, it unwillingly endorsed what the Russians believed when they started the war. You may violate the international law, you may kill, rape, and in the end, you will get away with that. That's exactly how the Russians perceived the results of the General Assembly in Karlsruhe. The WCC missed the same kairos, again following the General Assembly, when the official delegation of the Council visited Moscow in October 2022. The WCC official website on its front page published in a very celebratory mood. It was like, look, a sensation to celebrate, and they advertised this visit in October to Moscow. The title of the publication was like this: His Holiness Patriarch Kirill, WCC acting General Secretary, meaning Father Ioan Sauka, meet in Moscow, agreeing that war cannot be holy. I believe there is no much to celebrate. As first, the Patriarch never stated that any war could be holy. He never said a word that the war is holy. Moreover, for example, I recall it very well, he was unhappy when the former Patriarchate's speaker, late Father Vsevolod Chaplin, some of you have heard of him or knew him, used such an expression publicly. Chaplin publicly described the war in Syria as a kind of holy war, and the Patriarch was absolutely angry about that. It's not a part of his lexicon, to call the war holy. That's why he didn't say anything new. Moreover, and secondly, he did not call the war, the Patriarch did not call the war in Ukraine a war. According to the Russian playbooks, it is a special military operation. It's not a war. Therefore, by condemning wars, the Patriarch by default excluded the Russian special operation in Ukraine from this category of wars. And therefore, he completely complied with the Russian propaganda. He didn't say anything against the propaganda, because for this propaganda, what is happening in Ukraine is not the war. Thirdly, he had called this war metaphysical, which is not the same as holy. For him, it is a cosmic battle between the imagined Holy Rus and the global evil forces embedded in the West. In the communique, which was agreed upon by the WCC delegation and its Moscow hosts, the Patriarch explained the special operation in Ukraine by, I quote the communique, the political context. He added that the churches, and again I quote, must not add fuel to the fire. The well-intended Western public would read this message as following: the war is waged by the Kremlin, and the Russian Orthodox Church wants to abstain from supporting it. However, the Patriarch meant exactly the opposite. This war happens only because the Western politicians want it to be like that. And the global Christianity should not solidarize with what they impose on Russia. Well, the main point of the Patriarch is that the sanctions against Russia need to be lifted, and the churches need to be advocates for lifting sanctions against Russia. That was his message, essentially. Well, unfortunately, many in the global ecumenical community, I should admit, especially in the global South, would agree with such reading of the events. And the Patriarch knew that, and he tried to reach exactly those people, He managed to use the platform of the WCC and its loudspeaking facilities to address the ecumenical Urbi et Orbi. Well, in this case, Urbi is Geneva, of course, through the front page of the WCC's website. He channeled through it the main message of the Kremlin's propaganda. This is a war of the West against innocent Russia. The West should stop punishing Russia and should lift sanctions against it, and the churches across the globe should advocate for that. The WCC thus again allowed to be instrumentalized by the Russian propaganda. Although its sincere intention is to stop the war, I believe so, it continues against its will, contributing to it by offering a platform to this propaganda. Such helplessness also indirectly boosts the legitimacy of Putin's regime by legitimizing its main legitimizer, the Russian Orthodox Church. We observed the same pattern in 2015, and we still observe it. Lessons have not been learned. Therefore, one should not be surprised that the Moscow Patriarchate, in its statement following the General Assembly and during the visit of the WCC leaders to Moscow in October 2022, has been unusually generous in giving compliments to the Council and its leadership. I believe it is not just a form of diplomatic appeasement. In this case, Moscow finally means what it says. The Russian intention in its relations with the global ecumenical movement is to continue business as usual. That is also Putin's intentions in his relations with the West. His offer is simple. Ukraine is Russia's business, and the West must stay away from it minding its own business, primarily oil and gas. To some extent, he achieved his goal as the West continued its business as usual with Russia even after the annexation of Crimea and the proxy war in Donbass. We should not forget that the controversial Nord Stream 2 was conceived and built after 2014. The WCC, as I have demonstrated earlier, followed the same line in its relations with the Moscow Patriarchate. In February 2022, Putin tried to push his luck further and started a fully fledged war. The West, including Germany, woke up. However, the WCC did not. I interpreted General Assembly in Karlsruhe as an attempt to continue the ecumenical business as usual. Such an attempt was encouraging for the Russians, and by the Russians I mean both the Moscow Patriarchate and the Kremlin. Only now I can see some hints that the WCC's attitude may change. I mentioned already that I received a letter from the WCC which assured me that my critique of this General Assembly was heard, and that there are plans under the new leadership to establish a global think tank that would focus on the contemporary ecumenical social thought. It would probably address the war in Ukraine in a more appropriate way. Let us hope that this will come true, and let us see. I think that by abandoning the ecumenical business as usual, the WCC and other global and local ecumenical bodies can benefit themselves and others. First, they will serve better the goal of achieving sustainable peace. Convincing the Russian Orthodox Church to change its mind about the war would create a solid departure point for healing the Russian psyche from its war-mongering passions. Allow me to use the language of the Eastern asceticism. On the contrary, if this church is reassured, as it is indeed now, that it can get away with its support to the war, it will keep supporting violence. Violence based on the assumption that Russia is a superior civilization endorsed by God with a special mission to save the world from itself constitutes the core of Putinism. After Putin goes, Putinism will most probably stay alive and keep affecting popular imagination in Russia. The unrepented Russian church would be a vehicle of transmitting Putinism to the next generations of the Russians. This will increase the possibility, the risk of new wars in Europe. Second, the ecumenical movement, by engaging with the Russian Orthodox Church on the basis of critique and not business as usual, could remove some obstacles that impede this movement from moving forward. The war has reduced some of these obstacles ad absurdum. Take, for example, the dichotomization between East and West. It frames the way in which the Orthodox churches perceive and pursue their relations with the Catholic and Protestant churches. In the rhetoric of both the Kremlin's and Moscow Patriarchate's officials, such a dichotomization has reached the extreme of Manichaean dualism, when the West is seen as evil incarnated and Russia is ontologically good. Let me illustrate this thesis by what the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, who was the president from 2008 to 2012, posts on his social media. In one of his postings, well, he expresses really like a political theology of Putinism. He stated the following, I'm quoting him. "We are fighting against those who hate us, who ban our language, our values, and even our faith, who spread hatred towards the history of our fatherland. A part of the dying world is today against us. This is a bunch of crazy Nazi junkies, folks drugged and intimidated by them, and a large part of barking dogs from the Western Canal. With them, there is a motley herd of grunting guilds and narrow-minded Philistines from the collapsing Western Empire. with saliva flowing down their chins from degeneration. They have no faith and ideals except for obscene habits invented by them, as well as standards of doublethink. They deny the morality bestowed on normal people, meaning him. Therefore, by having risen against them, we have acquired sacred power. Such a sacred power, Medvedev explains, inspires the Russians using all sorts of weapons. He makes it clear that, I quote him again, we have the opportunity to send all enemies to the fiery Gehenna. Here Medvedev clearly alludes to nuclear weapons, but this is not our task, he reassures. We listen to the words of the Creator in our hearts and obey them. These words give us a sacred purpose. The goal is to stop the Supreme Lord of Hell, whatever name he uses, Satan, Lucifer, or Iblis. This is like a key figure in the Muslim demonology. End of quote. The words of the former Russian president, on the one hand, repeat sentences from the dark pages of the German past. On the other hand, they allude to the Cold War, when the communist Russia tried to be an alternative to the capitalist West. Look, this is the irony and a paradox. The difference between then and now is that the current Russian propaganda has replaced atheistic arguments with the religious ones. The Soviet ideologists believed that they contested the Western religious reactionism. They call it, I remember, from my childhood, religious reactionism, with the goal to benefit the world with a secular, bright future. Now, their successors in Putin's Russia, such as Dmitry Medvedev, contest the Western secularism with the goal to benefit the world with a religious, bright future. So they kind of swapped their rhetoric. In the past, they fought against religion in the name of secularism, and now they are fighting secularism in the name of religion. Essentially, they are fighting themselves. However, the religion they want for this future, bright future, is dualistic, misanthropic, and untheological. It is based on conspiracy theories rather than sacred texts and theological traditions. This religion is a distortion of the theological traditions it pretends to protect. In the ecumenical movement, I think we cannot tolerate such distortions anymore. We should not pretend that they are a part of orthodoxy, and as such should be respected. Like, you Orthodox, you have, those ideas, crazy ideas, however crazy they are. We respect it as a part of the Orthodox tradition, and we don't, give a dime about what you say. This is wrong, because those people, they distort the Orthodox, and if we respect, I understand that it's a part of the ecumenical ethos to respect, the tradition of each other. If we're really serious about, the tradition of the others, we need to make clear what is a distortion of this tradition and what is the genuine tradition. And I believe when the Russian delegations come to the meetings, ecumenical meetings, that they essentially present a sort of orthodoxy, which is a distortion of orthodoxy. In fact, these unorthodox theologies, they, with totalitarian pedigree, they discredit orthodoxy. By condemning them, we will show our respect to the orthodoxy and its rich theological tradition. By criticizing them, we can also clear our ecumenical path from the debris of various unhealthy ideologies. I have already mentioned that we have a chance to pull down the imagined wall between the East and the West. Although I believe this wall does not exist in reality, it has created a misleading polarization within the ecumenical movement. By confronting it, the movement can eventually get rid of the residues of the Cold War, which remain deeply entrenched in the WCC and other ecumenical organizations. Under the influence of that war, the Cold War, these organizations became too tolerant to the abuses of membership and manipulations based on false polarizations, like the ones that the Moscow delegation demonstrated in Karlsruhe. There is not only a deconstructing work that is waiting for us. Some constructive work needs to be done as well, especially in the European context. As I had many opportunities to urge, Putinism can be and should be tackled theologically. Something like what was done after the World War II in the framework of the theology after Auschwitz needs to be done now. We should produce together an update and orthodox localization of such theology, so to say. German theologians, both Catholic and Protestant, could be of particular help and input in this new ecumenical undertaking. Many say that the war in Ukraine helped many in Europe to better understand what it means to be European. It would be not an exaggeration to say that Europe, by standing by Ukraine, is regaining its raison d'être. The ecumenical movement also received a chance to regain its own raison d'être. This is a chance to overcome the so-called ecumenical fatigue. It is also a chance to renew ecumenical commitment. If the ecumenical movement keeps doing business as usual, it may waste these chances. By ignoring the war in Ukraine in the way it does, the WCC makes itself less relevant to what matters to our societies. On the contrary, by responding to it in the way it responds to other crises of our times, the movement can be invigorated in the same way as it was boosted after the World War I and World War II. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was in Karlsruhe some days, and it's very interesting to hear about your opinions. Some days with young people